Today, we're going to be ranking 10 arguments for the existence of God into a tier list. We're going to be ranking them based on their intelligibility, their intuitiveness, and their ability to stand up to scrutiny. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you do things differently? And what do you think about this tier list? The reason for why I've chosen these three categories is quite simple. Intelligibility is the idea of how easy it is to present an argument to someone, how difficult are the concepts in play. Intuitiveness is just how likely is someone going to accept the argument. For example, if I said it to a kid or someone who didn't know much about philosophy, how likely would they be convinced with little philosophical training? And then defense against objections is a very simple idea. I'm going to raise some objections against this argument. What are some responses to it? So those would be the three standards I'll be using to judge these arguments. Let us start with the Anselm ontological argument. Anselm's ontological argument is an argument which essentially can be summarized of God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. Since it's greater to exist in reality than exist purely in the mind, and since people can conceive of God, therefore God being the greatest conceivable being must exist in reality and instead of the mind. Now, of course, intelligibility-wise, this, I have to say, ranks very low, because at the end of the day, these deductive arguments for the existence of God, if you just said it to a kid, they'll be like, huh? What actually do you mean here? What do you mean when you say, oh, something exists in the mind and then it's greater to exist in reality, therefore God must exist in reality? It's not the most intelligible argument to understand. The concepts are quite complex. Likewise, intuitiveness, it's not very intuitive. I mean, yes, you could say, well, okay, it seems better to exist in reality than in the world, therefore it seems to follow that God being greater must exist in the world. But still, that's not exactly a very intuitive concept. Now, of course, some of the scholarship does say that Anselm wasn't indeed trying to make an argument for the atheist to convince them of God, but rather a meditation about a theist, of how a theist can understand more about God. So there is an idea that this wasn't actually meant to be convincing an atheist, but nonetheless, the lack of intuitiveness and intelligibility puts it off on a very poor note. Furthermore, there have been very good objections to Anselm's ontological argument, namely the Kantian idea that existence isn't a predicate. So the idea by saying that, okay, a God which exists in reality is better than a God which exists in the mind. Well, since existence isn't a predicate, adding that existence shouldn't change whether God is better in either one of the scenarios. So as a result, there have been good arguments, both structurally and also intuitively, against the Anselm's ontological argument, which makes it quite a poor argument. For those reasons, I would put Anselm's argument into the D tier, because it just really isn't very good in that perspective. All right, Anselm. Now, staying to the idea of ontological arguments, I'm now going to turn to the modal ontological argument, which is even more complex. The modal ontological argument uses S4 and S5 reasoning by saying if it's possibly necessary that something can exist, it is necessarily the case that that must exist in all possible worlds. Now, due to the reliance on modal reasoning, intelligibility, I have to say that's really one. It's worse than the Anselm's ontological argument. And also for intuitiveness, I'll also give it a 1, just because of how complex S5 and S4 logic is. Of course, if you understand philosophy well and you recognize these S4 and S5 axioms of if it's possibly necessary, then it's necessary, which is S5, and if it's necessarily necessary, then it is necessary, S4. Nonetheless, it is quite a strange concept to grasp initially. Therefore, it's not the most intelligible or intuitive argument. That being said, I would say it is very strong against objections. For example, as long as you grant S5 and S4, then the conclusion seems to follow that a necessary being must exist. Now, of course, there's further questions, perhaps stage 2 questions. Is necessary existence a property of God? Or does the S5 argument purely prove that one necessary being must exist? But nonetheless, if you accept the S5 axiomatic system, then, well, you kind of have the conclusion there for you. It's a deductive argument, so there's not much you can do about it. So although it's let down by its intelligibility, for philosophers, one can make the argument that the modal ontological argument ought to be an A-tier argument, and I would put it there because I do think it does prove the existence of a necessary being quite persuasively. Now, of course, I have that kind of temptation to drop into a B tier just because it's not very intelligible or intuitive, but for now, let's keep it in the A tier. Now, the next argument that let's talk about is the moral argument. I would like to present it in the way Dostoevsky kind of presents it through Ivan Karamazov. If there is no God, all things are permissible. Since some things are impermissible objectively, therefore there is a God. Now, this has been presented in a lot of different ways. For example, William Lane Craig likes saying, if there is objective moral values, there is a God. There are objective moral values, ergo there is a God. Well, I think that this argument is quite a powerful argument in both intelligibility and intuitiveness. Because if you think about it just from an intelligible perspective, okay, I can understand what moral values are pretty easily. Let's not go around and kill people. Okay, I kind of understand that. But also in a more metaphysical or metaethical perspective, you could be like, okay, if naturalism is true, evolution's all that there is, we're just random particles moving around in the world, well, how do we find moral values from a world of pitiless indifference, in the words of Dawkins? So, well, all right, if that's the case, then surely if God doesn't exist and everything's mere materialism, then, well, God surely then exists. And how about its ability to stand up to objections? I will say from that perspective, it stands up very well, because what are the only other two options for atheist to maintain a form of objective moral values? Well, they could be a Platonist, or they could just deny objective moral values. A Platonist being, okay, there are these objective forms of the good out there in a metaphysical sense, and therefore they provide us with objective moral values. But at the same time, most atheists, I'm not saying all atheists, but most atheists would say, well, I'm a naturalist as well, so I cannot accept these existence of supernatural forms, and therefore they would reject Platonism, which leads you either with objective values with God, or no objective subjective moral values without God. And for this reason, I would like to put moral values in the S-tier argument. It's easy to understand, easy to present, and also stands up pretty well against scrutiny. Now, the argument I'll turn to next is the design argument, which I would say, like the moral argument, is very good in its intelligibility and its intuitiveness. We all recognize some sense of design. I look at my phone, and this is the famous Paley's watch example. He'll be saying a watch, but I'll say a phone. I look at a phone and I'm like, this is clearly made by someone. It isn't made by a random person. It didn't come to existence by random chance, I mean. And if that's the case, then, well, surely the universe, being so complex, must be designed as well. And you hear in church all the time, I look at the stars, they're so complex. I look at the world, it's so complex. Therefore, God must exist. Now, although it's very good in intelligibility and intuitiveness, I have to say there's a lot of objections to it, which makes me not like this argument as a philosopher that much. And the reason for why I dislike this argument is because, well, if you think about it, firstly, it kind of begs the question because, well, how do we know anything is designed? If everything just purely random chance, then, well, there is no design at all. So in the sense of imposing design into anything, you're kind of presupposing the fact that it already is designed, and therefore it is somewhat circular. Furthermore, things like Darwinian evolution and the just length of time, things like that have been developed so much so that the actual arguments for the design argument of the design pointing to a God aren't really the strongest, which makes it a very difficult position for where I should place it. Because on one hand, I want to say I quite like it because of its intuitive strength, and if it's judged by intuitiveness and convincibility alone, I would put it up as an S tier just because of how influential it has been through time. But since it is not a very good philosophical argument, and since I am indeed a philosopher, I am tempted to put it in D tier. So I'll leave it in C tier for now, just to fill out C tier so far, but I might drop it to D tier in a bit. Now that we've talked a bit about the design argument, let's talk to another teleological argument, which is indeed the fine-tuning argument. The fine-tuning argument basically says there are certain cosmological principles which make the initial state of reality, the probability of a world which sustains life, or just the initial state of reality, very, very low probability. So the fact that the initial state of reality is the way that it is, and given the fact that it even sustains life, makes the probability for theism way higher, because the idea that all of this could come to be just via chance alone is very low. Now, of course, there have been people who raise things like the anthropic principle, or just the idea of a brute fact or a necessary universe, to say, well, all right, the universe must have been the case, or the ways in the certain laws of nature, they must have been the way that they are. The reality is those objections don't really respond to the fundamental argument in the fine-tuning argument that the initial state of reality, the probability, is just significantly minuscule. And therefore, given how minuscule those probabilities are, the chances of it being created by God is really high. Now, of course, some could accept the multiverse and brute facts hypotheses, and that might solve the idea of the fine-tuning argument, but nonetheless, I think it is quite strong at responding to its objections. Now, in regards to intelligibility and intuitiveness, it's not as intuitive as a design argument, but it's still rather relatively easy to understand. It says these things are so improbable, and therefore most people can have a solid grasp of the fine-tuning argument. So, and the only reason I put it in the B tier instead of the A tier is that there are other hypotheses out there, like multiverse hypotheses and the idea that the universe came by just via a brute fact or as a necessity. And although I don't buy into those hypotheses, I think there are potential other scenarios, so it's not as strong as the modal ontological argument or the moral argument. Now that we've finished talking about the fine-tuning argument, I will now turn to St. Thomas's contingency argument. The contingency argument, different from the Kalam cosmological argument, which we'll be talking in a bit, says that since all things are contingent, or since there are contingent things, there must be a necessary fundamental state of reality which causes all these contingent things. Now, the idea behind St. Thomas's argument is that infinite regresses cannot be completely disproved, and therefore, since he would allow for infinite regresses, he argues that even if you have an infinite regress, a necessary cause is fundamentally important. I would say that although this seems somewhat intuitive, it's not the most intuitive thing, for example. Although the causal principle is intuitive, the idea of infinite regresses and finite regresses might not be so intuitive or intelligible. It is still quite recognizable. But nonetheless, I would say that the objection of infinite regress is a very powerful one. Because if you say for each state x, there's a state x minus 1 that has a cause, then you can have an infinite regress of contingent causes without needing to terminate in a necessary being. So what I'm trying to argue is that the moment you allow for infinite regresses in contingency arguments, you no longer need a necessary cause in it, and therefore the argument collapses because it doesn't demonstrate the need for a necessary cause. And as a result, since there is no demonstration for a necessary cause in an infinite regress, I would put the contingency argument in the C tier purely because of the idea that an infinite regress gets rid of the need for a cause. Now, there is a way in which finite regresses would allow for the contingency argument to really move up the ladder, but that is the role of the Kalam cosmological argument. The cosmological argument, which is still based on a causal principle, but instead of trying to accommodate for infinite regress, argues from the fact that there is no infinite regress. The Kalam cosmological argument was presented by Muslim theologians, but revived recently by William Lane Craig, who argues that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. It is way more intuitive than the distinction between necessary and contingent beings, which is found in the contingency argument, and also more intelligible, because the idea of the universe existing is widely accepted by most people in society. The causal principle is widely accepted by most people in society. Yes, there are some people who object to it, but most people will accept the causal principle. And you put those two together, then you have the Kalam cosmological argument that the universe must have a cause. Now, there are some objections to the infinite regress. I'm not going to talk too much about the objections to the causal principle, just because I think it is very intuitive. And the moment you get rid of that, you kind of collapse the whole system of science and inductive reasoning. But if we talk about the discussions around infinite regresses, one can turn to the new developments of set theory and infinite set theory, especially about how infinite sets are possible. But there are numerous paradoxes about it, which I'm not going to talk about in this video. I will be interviewing Andrew Loke about this very soon, so stay tuned on this channel for that interview. But nonetheless, I do think there are good responses to infinite regresses and demonstrate the impossibility of infinite regresses or actual infinite regresses in the world, or concrete in academic terms. And therefore, since both of the premises of the cosmological argument, Kalam cosmological argument, are well defended, and also that it is a very intuitive argument, I would like to put the Kalam cosmological argument on S tier. This could be a very controversial one because a lot of people don't like it, but I do think that the Kalam cosmological argument does deserve its place in S tier just because of how intuitive it is and how easy it is to defend in most circumstances, both on a popular level. For example, people could appeal to the Big Bang and other cosmological, widely accepted cosmological truths, but also because people in a more sophisticated level in philosophy and in mathematics can also have a very rigorous discussion there as well. So I do think the Kalam cosmological argument does deserve its place on S tier alongside the moral argument. Now, after the Kalam cosmological argument, we have Pascal's wager, which basically says it's better to be a theist because, well, if there's a theist and you're right, then, well, you go to heaven. If you're an atheist and you're wrong, you go to hell. If you're a theist and you're wrong, then, well, you don't lose anything because nothing's going to happen after you're dead. And, well, if you're an atheist and you're wrong, well, then you're in the same situation as the theist. Now, there are a few problems with this argument. Although, of course, it is very intuitive and quite easy to present. It's quite intelligible. But the real problem comes in with its ability to stand up to objections. First of all, you can Pascal wager any form of different religions You could put Buddhism there, you could put Hinduism there, you could put Islam there, you could put Judaism, so which Pascal wager is applicable. You can't exactly say, okay, let's substitute Christian or theist and atheist for Hindu and Muslim. Okay, if the Muslim's right, then you go to heaven. If the Jews right, you go to hell. If the Buddhists right, you go to moksha. What exactly is going on here, right? So that kind of collapses a problem a bit as a philosophical argument. And likewise, the idea that in some sense, you're not really arguing for the existence of God, but just that my life becomes easier or I can have more confidence just because, oh, I believe in God. Well, that's not exactly a good justification that God exists. So as an argument for the existence of God, I have to say Pascal's wager falls into D tier. But if I could throw it in the bin and say it's not even an argument for God, I would have that category. In fact, let us add that category just for Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is not only on the D tier, but it is even on the not an argument tier. We had to create a tier for it. It's a very bad argument. Don't use it. Now, the last two, we have resurrection argument and personal experiences. Let's talk about the resurrection argument to start. Now, the resurrection argument basically says there are a certain amount of facts about history that we know. For example, Christ was crucified, Christ died, people believed that Christ resurrected, and that people believed that Christ resurrected so much that they kind of were willing to die for that belief. Now, based on that idea, you could say, well, okay, what should we do about the resurrection argument? Is that a very good argument? I am very kind of skeptical about it. Not in the sense that it's a bad argument, but I'm not sure how convincing it is. For example, the jump from a historical argument to the idea that a supernatural event must have occurred, or that Jesus Christ kind of risen from the dead, miracles from history. And you could say, well, there's a lot of miracles in history, and loads of things go into this, which makes it not a very convincing argument. Yes, it's intelligible, but it's not very intuitive to convince an atheist. An atheist might not reject it. So if it was just an argument for the theist, I would be tempted to put it in maybe a B or even an A tier. But if someone has methodological naturalism, which is the idea that, well, we should remove all supernaturalistic explanations for historical evidence or historical analysis, then, well, it probably should drop into the C tier, and that's where I think I will put it, just because arguments are presented with people and are part of a dialogue argument. If you cannot convince someone with it, then it's probably not the best argument there is. Now, the final argument that I'll talk about is personal experience. Now, personal experience is a very difficult one to talk about because, in some sense, personal experience is both the strongest and the weakest argument at all. For example, if someone truly saw God appear to them and literally had someone do miracles to their face and said, I am Jesus, I can raise your dad from the dead, or I can make you grow another head off your shoulder, and he actually goes and does it. Or maybe you have a dream and you actually experience the existence of God. Well, that should be a very convincing argument to you. In fact, if something like that happens and you literally grow a head or something miraculous happens, well, if you didn't believe in God, after that, well, nothing really is going to make you believe in God. And as a result, it's kind of one of those situations that if you're not even going to accept that personal experience, then you probably wouldn't really accept any other argument in the world, and you're probably not the most intellectually honest or open person. However, the same goes against it. It's like if I said I saw this religious experience, the very nature of a religious experience is that they're not very well at being communicated. William James and Rudolf Otto make the argument that a religious experience is a mysterium tremendum et fascinans, which says that a religious experience is a tremendous or a terrible and fascinating mystery. And that's the idea that you can't really communicate the essence and nature of a miracle to someone else. And since you can't communicate that nature of a miracle to someone else, the problem then arises as well, all right, it might be convincing for you, but it's not really going to convince someone else. If someone came to me and said, believe in Islam because, well, I saw Muhammad sing a song to me yesterday and made me grow 3 more heads on my shoulder, well, I'm going to be like, yeah, you're probably on hallucinogenics, mate. I sympathize why you might believe that that's true, and I sympathize that that's good reason for you to become a Muslim, but I'm not going to become a Muslim because of it. So in some sense, personal experience goes both on an S-tier argument, in a sense it's S-tier for the subjective experience, but it's also in the D tier if you don't really believe in it. If you don't believe in it yourself, or you're trying to convince someone of the personal experience, you probably wouldn't buy a personal argument very much. It might be convincing to you, but it's not going to be convincing to anyone else. I'll give it a benefit of the doubt. I'll put it in C tier. Why not? I don't know. I'm very torn. I'll put it in D tier. So this is indeed our finished tier list. We have the moral argument and Kalam cosmological argument at S tier, modal ontological argument at A tier, fine-tuning at B tier. C tier has design, contingency, and resurrection arguments. D tier, you have Anselm's ontological argument and the argument from personal experience. And finally, Pascal's wager is not even an argument. Let me know what your thoughts are of this tier list. Would you agree, change your positions of anything? What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon. Thank you for watching. God bless and goodbye. I'll see you in the next one.